So, you've decided that you want to get sub 10. Well, in this video I'm going to show you my 5 simple tips that should hopefully help you to get sub 10. So the way this video is going to work is I've got an 8.3 average of 5 which I've recorded, and for each solve I'm going to break it down and explain something from that solve that made it a good solve, that made it sub 10, and all of these tips from each solve should hopefully be things that you can implement into your own solves. So tip number 1 is focus on the flow of your solve. So this first solve, it was definitely obvious to me that the flow was the thing that made it a good solve, 7.87. So the efficiency of the solve may not have been the best, but the flow was good. So I'll go into a quick reconstruction of the solve. So first I had this blue and white cross piece, this orange and white cross piece here, and this red and white cross piece. And I also had this green and white cross piece over here, which was already attached to its center. So I aligned the blue one and the orange one by doing those two moves, and then this red and white cross piece was also aligned with its center. So then I just moved those over so they were attached in their correct positions and finished the cross. Now that was a pretty simple cross, and it meant that I could easily focus on what my first pair was going to be during it. So I focused on these two pieces, the red and blue and the red and blue and white corner, and it may not have been the most efficient way of connecting these two and solving the pair, but it was effective. And then next up I saw this piece here, the green and orange and white piece and the green and orange edge, and connected these two up and rotated and inserted them. Again, not the most efficient way to build the pairs, but the flow of the solve was nice because I wasn't pausing very much between pairs. So lastly, I rotated and built these two pairs, these two pieces, connected this pair. So that was the green and red and the red and green and white. In the back, like that. So now that was solved. And that just left me with this piece, the white and blue and orange, and the corresponding orange and blue edge, which I connected in the back, like so. So the F2L in that solve may not have been the most efficient, and there were probably a few too many rotations, but the solve altogether flowed quite well. Just from the start, it started off well because the cross was simple and I could look ahead to my first pair, and then there were minimal pauses throughout, and then I had a pretty easy last layer. So flow in your solves is important. Not so much that it outweighs efficiency, but it is something to keep in mind when you don't really need to solve the most efficient pairs every time, because sometimes that might make your flow poor. So tip number 2 is minimize rotations. So this second solve helps to reinforce my first tip about flow, because this solve did not flow well. If you look at it, you'll be able to tell that I paused a lot, and the moments between pairs was just very long, slow pauses, which was not good. But I'll get into the solve itself. So I started off with this green and white edge, orange and white cross edge, and blue and white cross edge, with the red and white cross edge down here. So what I did, which is not the best cross solution in this case, I did figure out a couple that were better, but I moved this over there, then brought these two down like this. So I had these three aligned relative to each other, and then I just rotated and inserted this last blue edge like this and did a D2 to finish the cross. So then what I was faced with here was I saw these two, and I rotated, so I had this orange and blue edge and the orange and blue and white corner and inserted them into the back like that. Then next up I had these two lined up, so that's the red and green edge and then the red and green and white corner, and those were set up for a nice three mover like this. And here is something which comes quite naturally over time, but it's definitely something that you do want to focus on implementing into yourself. So I had the blue and red edge and the blue and red and white edge, and some people don't do this. I know I didn't for a long time. If you already are, that's great, but using like a lefty insert here rather than rotating just saves me a lot of time. So I used my left hand here to insert that pair there, and then again here, instead of rotating to solve this last green and orange and white with the orange and green corner, I just inserted it into the back like that. And then last layer was pretty straightforward, except I did do something very dumb. I did a U3 here before doing that PLL. But the important thing to note from that rather poor solve is that you should focus on using your left hand or inserting things into the back to minimize rotations. So tip number 3 is drill your last layer algs, because at this point, getting sub 10, you don't want to spend that much time on the last layer because you don't have that much time. You need to be solving in around 9 seconds. So to do that last layer, you don't want it to take any more than like 2 to 3 seconds, like at a maximum, obviously. So yeah, drilling your last layer algs is really important. So this solve, the last layer was well executed, but the rest of the solve I wouldn't read too much into because it was mostly just lucky during F2L, and that's what made it a 7.8. So yeah, I'll just run through it pretty quickly here. So we had the blue and white cross piece, and this is a terrible cross, never do anything like this. Orange and white, so I moved these two, align them like that, and then the remaining two were here, this red and white which was already connected to its center, and the green and white here. So then I aligned that down here with these last two, aligned the cross and brought this down. And then first thing I saw was these two, the red and green and white and the red and green edge, inserted those into the back. Then I saw the blue and orange and white corner and the blue and orange edge, inserted those easily like this. These two here, red and blue and white corner and the blue and red edge, rotated, inserted those like that. And then these two, the orange and green and orange and green. And then here we get to last layer, an easy case here. And then here what I want to talk about mostly is the PLL here. So here I use an alg that I'm like pretty comfortable with, which is something that is important in the last layer. Like, don't necessarily go with the algs that everyone uses, because some algs may work better for your turning style than the majority of people's turning style. Another thing I did here was during PLL, this is already lined up, so I could have rotated to execute like this, but instead, because I already needed to regrip to execute the alg, because you begin in this grip, doing a U prime here doesn't actually like take away any time because I'm going to be regripping anyway. And then after I finish the execution of the alg, it's also really easy to AUF doing a drag like that, because it sets your fingers up like that. So the PLL there was well executed and like pretty well thought out how I did it there. But yeah, the main thing to take away from that solve is just definitely drill algs and pick algs that suit your turning style. Obviously don't do things that are too long. I think JPerm recently actually released a video on sort of like how you can tell if an algorithm is good or bad. So yeah. So tip number 4 is know your F12 solutions. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to know them like an algorithm, but basically with practice, so the key thing here is practice, and focusing on what you're doing in your solves, and looking into efficient ways on solving pairs, you should be able to know what you're going to do for every F12 case basically, and be able to execute it quite quickly without thinking. And this is really important for look ahead, and just like therefore flow in your solves. So for this solve, the F12 was really good. The cross and last layer were a bit subpar, a bit of a lock up here. But anyway, for my cross solution, I had this red and white edge here, this green and white edge here, and the orange and white edge here, and the blue and white edge here. So they were all flipped like that. So I brought this red and white one down like this, then the green and white one down like that, then the orange and white one down like that, and then the blue and white one up like this. And then I kind of did a bit of a thing like that, and started from here. So then the first thing I must have seen is this white and red and blue corner and this red and blue edge. So I just took that out and inserted it like that. Very simple, and then immediately I saw these and knew that this is how I would solve them. So what I meant here was immediately I saw the blue and orange and white corner and the blue and orange edge, solve them like so. Then next I saw this white and green and red corner and the green and red edge, so I rotated and inserted it like that. And then for these last two, the orange and green and the orange and green corner and edge, I split them up like this, rotated and inserted them like that. And then last layer, and done. So the F12 solutions there were all relatively efficient, and though they may not have been like the perfect thing that maybe Felix might do, they were all things that I was comfortable executing, and it meant that they all flowed really well, and I could focus on what I was doing next, what I was going to do next while I was doing the current F12 pair, and I could execute them very quickly as well because I was quite comfortable with them, which made the F12 in that solve flow very well and made it very quick. Tip number 5 is try to build good practice habits. So this isn't strictly necessary for getting sub 10, I know, because I've never really put much time into building good practice habits, but I think it's definitely something you want to do earlier rather than later. Because now it's definitely harder to improve for myself, as I've been stuck between 9 and 10 seconds, averaging around low 9 for quite a long time now. So what you definitely do want to do is balance the time that you spend doing solves and the time that you spend learning new things and implementing new things into your solves. I've heard this from lots of people like Jaden McNeil. So it's just an important thing to do if you want to keep improving. You need to keep learning things rather than just continuing to do what you already know over and over, which will probably get you to sub 10 assuming you already have some good habits. But looking at improvement past sub 10, you definitely do want to be creating these habits. So I'll quickly reconstruct the last solve, which isn't particularly relevant to this, but there are, you probably noticed throughout all of these solves some bad habits that I have, which I haven't really spent much time trying to remove, which could definitely speed my times up. So for this, I had this white and green cross edge already attached to the white center there. This red and white cross edge already attached to its red center here, and then the blue and white down here and the orange and white up here. So what I first did was I brought the orange and white down like so, and then connected the blue and white at the back like that, aligned the cross and brought the red and white down. And then the first thing I saw was this green and red corner and the green and red edge. So I rotated and connected those and inserted them in the back like that. Next thing I did was rotated again and built these two using this space to separate these two. So I had the green and orange and the orange and green corner, separated them and inserted them like that, which luckily happened to pair this up, which I believe I did like this. So then I had the blue and orange edge and the orange and blue corner, which I inserted like that. And then I think I did a U2 to see what OLL was. And then OLL, and then PLL. So as you can see, throughout this whole video you will have seen definitely some bad habits in my solves. I probably rotate a bit too much. And I have practiced this down so that my solves do still look pretty alright most of the time. But it's definitely important moving forward down to sub 9, sub 8, even sub 7. You definitely need to be learning new things to improve, because it just gets harder and harder to improve. And these little things, little habits that you may not want to fix now, definitely will stop you from getting to that next level.